This hearing will come to order. Last week, a commander in Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps made headlines around the world for boasting that Iran could wipe out Israel in less than 8 minutes. And remember, this is the same Iran that Secretary Kerry is promoting as open for business. Sadly, in the 4 months since the nuclear agreement with Iran was implemented, few things have surprised me. I expected Iran to continue full speed ahead with its intercontinental ballistic missile program, and it has, testing 2 ICBMs. And remember, as the Secretary of Defense says, intercontinental means able to reach from there to here. We have also seen the testing of ballistic missiles, and in case we misconstrue their intent, on the side of these ballistic missiles were the words, "Israel must be destroyed," in Farsi, but also in Hebrew. It is no surprise that Iran's abysmal human rights record continues, the executions continue, the torturing in Evin prison continues. 2 more Americans have now been taken hostage. And it is no surprise that the agreement, with $100 billion plus, is strengthening the Revolutionary Guards and others responsible for these abuses. I'm not all that surprised that Iran may hold its nuclear program to the letter of the agreement. After all, it was this committee that exposed the agreement's central flaw, and that central flaw is the Sunset Clause. With its nuclear infrastructure kept intact and key restrictions that expire, Iran does not have to cheat to get the bomb. Instead, it just simply must wait out the clock to get the bomb. But what is astonishing, and that is the reason for this hearing, what is astonishing is the length the Obama administration has gone to accommodate Iran. It is bad enough that the administration essentially rewrote counterterrorism laws through executive action, or that it has hardly responded to Iran's missile tests. The administration told us that sanctions on Iran's terrorism, on their human rights, on their ballistic missiles would be fully enforced after the agreement. Yet it now says that non-nuclear sanctions would undermine the Iran agreement. So, what has happened is that the White House's Iran's policy now amounts to walking on eggshells. And in another odd twist, the Obama administration is going beyond the agreement to purchase material used in the production of nuclear weapons from Iran. As one prominent expert summed up, we shouldn't be paying them for something they shouldn't be producing in the first place. But the State Department has taken its advocacy for Tehran to a new and disturbing level by trying to persuade major non-U.S. banks that doing Iran-related business is not only permitted, but is actually encouraged. As one witness told the committee earlier this month, we are acting as the business development and trade promotion authority of the Islamic Republic of Iran. International businesses must deal with the reality of an Iran whose Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps controls the broadest of sectors across the Iranian economy, not the administration's fantasy in which Iran's behavior can be ignored and investment can be pushed into the country. They hear the warnings of the Financial Action Task Force, which sets the global anti-money laundering standards. As Stuart Levy, the former Treasury official who was responsible, as we, in a bipartisan way, passed legislation over the years in this committee for sanctions on Iran, that former Treasury official in both administrations was responsible for much of the sanctions architecture that squeezed Iran. As he wrote in the Wall Street Journal, why is Washington pushing non-banks to do what is still illegal for American bankers to do? And I'll just add to that, what the International Financial Action Task Force says no banks should be doing. Last week, Secretary Kerry went so far as to say that European leaders are looking at ways to subsidize investments into Iran. Where does it stop? And Iran is still pushing for access to the U.S. dollar, the world's top currency. Given the administration's lack of any resolve to stand up to the Supreme Leader, we are right to pursue legislation to prevent that from happening. And I now turn to the ranking member for any opening comments he may have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. To our witnesses, welcome to the Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm grateful that the administration has kept Congress up to speed on the Iran nuclear deal throughout the process, and I know there are many areas where we can continue to work together on this issue. Ambassador Mull, it's good to see you again. Assistant Secretary Countryman, we're glad to have your voice in the mix as well, although we miss you in the Balkans. And Acting Under Secretary Zubin, you're doing great work, despite the fact that you have to do your job with one hand tied behind your back. We hear a lot of talk on Capitol Hill about how we need to do all we can to curb rogue regimes and terrorist groups. Well, one easy thing for our Senate colleagues to do would be to bring your nomination up for a vote. It's been too long, and it should happen. Commentary and analysis about the Iran deal has become the latest cottage industry in foreign policy circles. I'm sure at this point most of you know my refrain. I opposed the deal. I voted against it. I thought we could have done better, but now that it's in place, we need to ensure it's implemented to the letter and continue to hold Iran's feet to the fire with respect to the regime's other dangerous and destabilizing activities. Today, I hope our witnesses who are on the front lines of implementation can help us cut through the speculation and political noise-making around the deal and give us a clear picture of how things are moving forward. For example, we keep hearing that because Iran hasn't yet realized the anticipated windfall from sanctions relief, the administration is going around the world trying to drum up business for Iran. Now, in my experience, when something sounds like a political attack, it's usually because it is. I don't think we should be making any concessions to Iran beyond the scope of what's in the deal, but it's perfectly reasonable for the United States to clarify for businesses what kind of transactions are now in bounds and what remains against the law. In my view, at the end of the day, if businesses continue to shy away from investing in Iran, Iran's leaders have no one to blame but themselves. After all, with its history of corruption, money laundering, support for terrorism, human rights abuses, and an illegal ballistic missiles program, Iran doesn't exactly seem like a smart bet for investing. That's why the Financial Action Task Force, FATF, continues to designate Iran as a high-risk jurisdiction. So hopefully our witnesses can shed more light on why sanctions relief has only led to a trickle rather than a surge for Iran, and how the United States has responded as this aspect of the deal has unfolded. I'd also like to hear about what we're doing and what we plan to do to pressure Iran on other areas of concern. As President Obama wrote during the consideration of the Iran deal, he, quote, made sure that the United States reserved the right to maintain and enforce existing sanctions and even to deploy new sanctions to address those continuing concerns which we fully intend to do when circumstances warrant, unquote. I don't think we should be shy about slapping new sanctions on Iran, again, if the situation and circumstances warrant. After Iran's ballistic missile test late last year, the administration did impose new sanctions. That was the right thing to do. The test was a clear violation of the UN Security Council resolution governing the nuclear deal. But Iranian money continues to flow to Hamas to rebuild its network of terror tunnels. Hezbollah has stockpiled thousands of rockets, courtesy of Iran's generosity. It's fair to say that Hezbollah would not exist if it wasn't for Iran. The Assad regime, Iran supports them. Hezbollah has propped up that Assad regime. It couldn't do it without Iranian help. Shia militants in Iraq and Houthi fighters in Yemen can still count on Iran's support, and we have intercepted ship after ship carrying Iranian weapons. So what's the plan to deal with all these problems? How will the administration use the authorities it already has? What can Congress do to make sure this administration and future administrations have all the tools they need? How can we and our allies compel Iran to change its behavior? I look forward to hearing our witnesses' thoughts on these areas. I thank you all again for your service and your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We're pleased to be joined by a very distinguished panel this morning.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I was going to try to pick up on Mr. Elliott's 20. I just ask unanimous consent that the IAEA report on of January on implementation be entered into the record.
Without objection, Mr.
I
Connolly,
thank the
it will
Chair.
be.
Forgive me for the interruption.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. We are joined by Ambassador Stephen Moll. He serves as the lead coordinator for Iran nuclear implementation at the Department of State, and prior to his appointment, Ambassador Moll served as the ambassador to Poland and as executive secretary of the State Department. And we have Mr. Thomas Countryman. He's assistant secretary in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. He is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service, and Mr. Countryman most recently served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for European Affairs. Mr. Adam J. Zubin is acting Undersecretary for the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at the Department of the Treasury. He previously served as Director of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control. We welcome all three of our witnesses back to the committee, and without objection, all the full prepared statement of these witnesses will be made part of the record. Members here will have 5 calendar days to submit any statements or questions or any other extraneous material for the record. And so I'll ask the ambassadors if they would please summarize their remarks, and we'll start with Ambassador Moll.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Engel, and all the members of this committee. It's great to be back here with you again today to talk about where we are in implementing what remains one of the highest priorities of the Obama administration, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. And I'm happy to report today that so far the JCPOA has been fully implemented by all of its participants according to its terms. I think it's important that we recognize what an accomplishment that is towards advancing not only our national security, but that of our closest friends and allies, particularly those in the Middle East. Because of our efforts to date and our success in this agreement, the security of the United States and our partners has been enhanced, and in conversations with allies and partners around the world, we regularly hear support from our closest friends for this deal. As of implementation day in January under the JCPOA, Iran had completed dozens of specific actions to limit, freeze, or roll back its nuclear program and subject it to greater transparency by the IAEA. That included shipping out 25,000 pounds, 98% of Iran's supply of enriched nuclear material, cutting its centrifuge enrichment program by more than 2/3 and subjecting itself to very tight controls going forward, destroying the core of the Iraq heavy water reactor, which would have permitted the production of weapons-grade plutonium. And Iran's implementation together of all of these commitments increased the time it would take to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon, the so-called breakout time, from roughly 2 months to more than a year. These actions were complemented by the historically comprehensive verification and monitoring measures specified in the JCPOA. Iran is now subject to the greatest monitoring and verification regime in the history of nuclear power, providing us with confidence with Iran that if Iran should seek to break out of its commitments, such an attempt would be detected and we would have ample time to respond. At the same time in this deal, we have preserved our ability to snap back penalties that made this deal possible in the first place. But as of now, we have not had to take those measures of snapping back the penalties because Iran is fully compliant with the terms of the deal, as the IAEA verified in February, and as I expect it will again in its next report in the coming weeks. In exchange for Iran's meeting its nuclear commitments under the JCPOA, we met ours by lifting the so-called secondary sanctions on Iran. In an effort to provide greater clarity to the public and private sectors of what sanctions were lifted and what non-nuclear sanctions remain in place, we have been participating in outreach with the public and private sectors at the request of our foreign partners and foreign governments in order to explain U.S. commitments under the JCPOA. As long as Iran continues to meet its nuclear commitments, we'll continue to meet our commitments on sanctions. While we're encouraged by Iran's implementation of its nuclear commitments thus far, we have always recognized that the JCPOA would not resolve all of our concerns with Iran, and in fact, those concerns are still very much active. Instead, the JCPOA was specifically aimed at addressing the most urgent issue of verifiably ensuring that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. Thanks to our efforts to date, we've made significant progress towards that goal, and the United States and our partners remain safer because of those efforts. I look forward to your questions later on in the hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ambassador Countryman.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, I want to thank you for your service, and in particular for this invitation. It is always an honor for me. Ambassador Moll has laid out our progress in the successful implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Program of Action. My Bureau is focused upon giving full support to those implementation activities, and among a number of functions, I would emphasize helping to assure that the International Atomic Energy Agency has the independence, the expertise, and above all, the resources needed for full implementation of the JCPOA. And thanks to the support of Congress, I'm happy to say that the IAEA, in fact, has sufficient resources and expertise to do this mission. In the future, besides the Iran mission, the IAEA does a number of other functions that are central to U.S. national security, and I look not only to this administration and Congress, but to future administrations and Congresses to ensure that the IAEA continues to have those important resources, both for implementation of this agreement and for the full range of its functions. And in the interest of diligent, scrupulous implementation of the JCPOA, it would be extremely valuable for the Senate to confirm a highly qualified individual, Laura Holgate, to be our full-time confirmed ambassador to the UN missions in Vienna. While the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran has been addressed through implementation of this agreement, we recognize that, like every previous arms control agreement negotiated by any administration, an arms control agreement does not change the full range of behavior of the partner or adversary with whom we are negotiating. And so there remains a need, as both the chairman and ranking member have noted, to address the full range of serious misbehavior by the Iranian regime. The particular responsibility of my Bureau is to address the ballistic missile program of Iran, as well as a number of other proliferation-related efforts in the conventional field as well. We do this through the rigorous implementation of sanctions. That is, by designating, in partnership with the Department of Treasury, those entities in Iran responsible for the weapons program. And we have designated every major entity in Iran associated with the ballistic missiles program. We'll continue to do so as new information becomes available. At the same time, I'll give you my personal opinion that it is not UN resolutions or designations or sanctions that cause Iran to change its calculus and its interest in the ballistic missile program. But what we can do to slow and deter and make their missile choices painfully expensive to the Iranian regime is rigorous enforcement of strategic trade control. And we do that not only in partnership with a wide range of U.S. agencies, but in partnership with more than 40 countries under the Missile Technology Control Regime, with more than 100 partner countries under the Proliferation Security Initiative. And as a result, all the legally binding restrictions on missile technology for Iran that are contained in UN resolutions are successfully implemented, not to the point, and I admit this first, of preventing Iran from a continued interest in these programs. But I can assure you of our continued diligence in using not just declaratory statements, but actual tools of interdiction and export control to slow Iran's progress. And of course, beyond my Bureau's purview, we work closely with our regional partners, including the Gulf Cooperation Council and Israel, to bolster their defenses against a continuing military threat from Iran. We have no intention of reducing our focus on Iran's other programs, even as we continue with the successful implementation of the JCPOA. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Chairman Royce, Ranking Member Engel, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear today to discuss our implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA. Very soon after I joined the Treasury Department in 2004, we saw with alarm the progress that Iran was making in its covert nuclear program and understood that this was a national security threat of the highest order. From that time, the talented women and men in my office have devoted literally tens of thousands of hours to address this threat. It's been an effort like nothing I've ever seen. Working with the intelligence community to identify and track Iranian front companies and their movements of funds through hidden accounts. Working with the private sector, here and abroad, to strengthen the vigilance with respect to Iran. Working with law enforcement and regulators to hold sanctions violators accountable. Working with our diplomats and with foreign counterparts to make clear to Iran that the price of their nuclear program was complete isolation from the international community. And working with you in Congress, particularly here in this committee, in a bipartisan effort to sharpen our sanctions tools, deepen their impact, and bring Iran to the table. After nearly a decade, the accumulated pressure had its intended effect. The Iranian people rejected the course that their government had charted and elected President Rouhani to ease the pressure and obtain a better economy and a brighter future for the Iranian people. The JCPOA was a tremendous breakthrough. It represents a peaceful solution to what had been one of the world's most serious national security threats. Iran was a few months from having enough fissile material for a potential nuclear weapon, and it was advancing. Now, Iran's breakout time has been extended to beyond a year, and we are safer because of it. Since Iran has kept its end of the deal, we must uphold ours. It is in our national security interest to ensure that the JCPOA works as intended and stands the test of time. It is therefore important that we fulfill all of the commitments we made in the deal. Iran is already seeing benefits under this deal. It has been able to open new bank accounts. It's been able to gain access to billions of dollars in reserves, and its oil exports to Europe have recovered to about 1/2 of their pre-sanctions levels. That said, some companies, banks around the world continue to have concerns about doing business in Iran. Some are concerned about their financial transparency, the designation of Iran as a high-risk jurisdiction by FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, the world standard-setting body for anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing. Others are noting concerns about corruption as well as regulatory and other obstacles to conducting business in Iran, and still others cite Iran's provocative behavior outside the nuclear file, including its active support for terrorism and its ballistic missile testing. As President Obama said recently, Iran has to understand what every country in the world understands, which is businesses want to go where they feel safe, where they don't see massive controversy, where they can be confident that transactions are going to operate normally. As Iran pursues more business, it is incumbent on Iran to address such problems, to undertake meaningful reforms and create an environment in which businesses feel secure. I've talked a bit about the sanctions relief that we've delivered, but I also want to be clear about what this deal does not mean. First, with certain limited exceptions, the primary U.S. embargo on Iran remains in place, including the prohibitions on U.S. persons investing in Iran and the prohibitions on Iran accessing U.S. markets and banks. Along these lines, let me say clearly that we have not promised, nor do we have any intent to give Iran access to the U.S. financial system or reinstate what's known as the U-turn authorization. Additionally, we have maintained all of our sanctions designed to counter Iran's malign activities outside of the nuclear file. Iran continues to be the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and to play a significant and negative role in destabilizing the region. Under our current sanctions regime, We've designated more than 200 Iranian-linked firms and individuals on non-nuclear grounds. That includes IRGC, the Quds Force, their subsidiaries, their senior officials, their front companies and agents, all of whom we are continuing to target and expose. That also includes major Iranian defense and missile entities, as noted by Assistant Secretary Countryman, which are behind Iran's current ballistic missile work. Indeed, since the implementation of the JCPOA, we have continued to target new Iranian actors, including key supporters of their ballistic missile program, agents of Mahan Air, the Quds Force support airline, and central Hezbollah money laundering individuals. Indeed, I can tell you that after many years of targeting Hezbollah, today the group is in its worst financial shape in decades. Ultimately, we have been and will remain clear-eyed about the nature of the threat posed by Iran, and we will continue to combat these threats using the range of tools at our disposal, including our sanctions, and by designating new targets as appropriate. I want to thank this committee again for inviting me to appear today, and I look forward to our continued work with your committee and to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Zubin, and I do appreciate your work in terms of targeting Hezbollah. The legislation that I and Elliot Engel passed and the committee passed in December to the President's desk, and your implementation of that is appreciated. But you noted in your testimony that the United States has, in your words, no plans to give Iran access to the U.S. financial system. I appreciate that clarification. However, that hasn't been the source of our concern. Let me be specific here. Does the United States have any plans to offer Iran the ability to access offshore dollar clearing facilities to allow for dollar-denominated transactions and ease Iran's ability to trade internationally? Or are there plans for the administration to allow the Iranians to conduct large-scale dollar-denominated transactions and dollar clearing in any form? And your testimony, as I heard it, studiously avoided that question. So let me put that to you.
Thank you, Chairman, for the question, and I welcome the chance to clarify an area that I think has been the subject of a lot of confusion and concern. Our sanctions, our primary sanctions in the U.S., control what U.S. actors can do and what they cannot do. That governs the conduct of U.S. actors anywhere they reside in the world. So, for example, a branch of a U.S. bank in Europe, in East Asia, has to behave like a U.S. person here in Washington or here in New York. Our sanctions, on the other hand, do not control the actions of non-U.S. persons. Whether or not the currency they're using is the dollar, the euro, the pound, or the yen. So to be very specific, every foreign bank in the world has U.S. dollars in their possession. It is, thankfully, the international currency of choice for international trade. That means banks in Europe, Japan, China all hold dollars in their vaults. Our sanctions don't extend to those dollar bills. And foreign actors aren't under our jurisdiction if they choose to give those to any actor, including an Iranian actor. And so I just want to be clear as to the contours of our jurisdiction in response to offshore dollar clearing. That's something that's beyond
But
our
that seems to have a different intent than the response the Treasury Secretary gave me when I asked him in the Financial Services Committee this question. I asked the Treasury Secretary, I think it was 2 months ago, if he stood by his testimony during the agreement's consideration in which we were assured they would not have access. Instead of shutting the door right there, Secretary Lew said his focus was on making sure Iran gets relief. And 2 months since, the President still has not responded to my letter on this question. So there's been ample time for the administration to bring absolute clarity to this question. And the concern is that while Iran wouldn't be allowed direct access to the dollar, you could structure a scheme offshore that would have similar impact. So I just remind you, it's Treasury itself, it's your department that has declared the entire territory of Iran as a primary money laundering concern, and that means that any financial transaction with Iran or any offshore scheme that is set up risks supporting the regime's ongoing illicit activities, including ballistic missile activities and everything else. Let me go to a question for Assistant Secretary Countryman.
Mr. Chairman, would I just be able to clarify something from
Yes, but you can clarify it. But Iran is pushing this, right? I mean, I read the translations of the Iranian papers. I see what they're pushing for, but go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted, and thank you for the opportunity, I just wanted to clarify, Secretary Liu has made himself clear on the record in public, and of course we look forward to responding to your letter to be clear in writing as well. But he has said exactly what I have said here today, and I know he was looking forward to me being here to be able to relay his views on this, which is Iran will not have access to our financial system.
Perfectly fair, but when I asked him the question, the focus was on making sure Iran gets relief. And so let me go to the next question, and this is to Assistant Secretary Countryman. The last question I'll ask here. In your testimony, you put stock in the new UN Security Council Resolution 2231 and its provisions related to Iran's ballistic missile program. Now, it's well documented that before the deal, Iran was legally bound by UN Security Council resolutions not to test ballistic missiles. Now, here's the problem in the negotiation. The first problem, one that the members of the committee are already aware of, and that is the administration agreed to a change. Instead of saying shall not, the change was Iran shall be called upon not to. All right? So that was watered down. But there's other language in there, new language, that focuses on Iranian missiles designed, and this is something that frankly I missed, designed to be capable of delivering nuclear weapons, while it previously focused on missiles capable of delivering nuclear weapons, okay? So what was the rationale for using the words missile designed to be capable of instead of simply missiles capable of? If I could ask that.
I don't know the answer. I was not involved in the negotiations. I'll get you an answer if I can. I would note that the new Resolution 2231 does not change the substantive prohibition on provision of any kind of ballistic missile technology to Iran.
Well, wait, but you have the Iranian foreign minister saying that that word in these negotiations, designed, he said, it took me 7 months to negotiate, so everybody knew what it meant. And so what they're saying now is with the change, Iran shall be called upon not to, rather than not to, that they can go forward full speed with their ICBM program, and that's what they're doing. As we sit here, that's what they're doing. And it's not as though they're hiding the intent. They combine that with the rhetoric, death to America, death to Israel. I just think we've got a situation. Well, let me let you respond.
I don't believe Iran has ever hidden its intent to continue developing ballistic missiles, nor has it slowed down doing so, no matter what administration took what steps.
But here's what we've got. We've got a situation now where the Security Council, I mean, what can we point to where we can say the Security Council now is taking action against Iran's missile program? None that I can see.
I understand we have fewer rhetorical points to make. I don't focus on the rhetoric. I focus on the active effort to deny the export of technology from advanced countries to Iran. I understand that Iran's interpretation is different from ours.
But our difficulty here is that we've now given Russia, or we've given Beijing, the ability to interpret this differently. We have forever now a less effective constraint on Iran's missile program than we had before. And on top of that, we now see Iran asserting this in the international community, and we don't see the pushback from the United States. This is the point I wanted to make to you. My time's expired. I'll go to our ranking member, Mr. Engel of New York, for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Zubin, let me ask you this. When Congress was considering whether to oppose a nuclear deal with Iran, we heard various statements from administration officials that Iran's non-nuclear behavior which is, of course, support for terrorists, human rights violations, advancing their ballistic missile program, that those things would be outside of the scope of the deal. Yet, since implementation day, we've heard a different message. No new sanctions. We've heard that from the administration. No new sanctions, even if they are outside the scope of the deal. So can you clarify the administration's position? Because I thought that we were told that in their support, Iran's support for terrorism, that we could slap additional sanctions on it and it would not violate the JCPOA. If Iran had launched missiles, ballistic missiles, and we wanted to penalize them, that would not butt heads with the JCPOA. But now we hear differently. So would the administration veto none new non-nuclear sanctions against Iran if the new sanctions are not intended to relist delisted entities?
Thank you, Ranking Member Engel.
And I'm sorry. Let me also say, when you're giving the answer, would the imposition of non-nuclear sanctions violate our obligations under the JCPOA?
I appreciate the opportunity to clarify the administration's views on this, and I would also offer Ambassador Mull, if he wants to come in when I conclude,
certainly,
to provide his view from the State Department. Our view has not been no new sanctions since implementation day, and in fact, to the contrary, you've seen the administration announce multiple rounds of new sanctions designations in exactly the areas you're talking about. Iran's support for terrorism, their ballistic missile program, Hezbollah, Mahan Air. We have been continuing on our path to knock out the key proxies that these companies are using to procure materials and to move money. So we've been very consistent on that from exactly, as you said, our statements announcing the deal and on throughout, including less than 2 months ago, new designations of the Quds Force affiliated airline Mahan Air, and new designations against the liquid propellant missile companies within Iran that work under SHIG, the Shahid Hamad Industrial Group. With respect to new legislation, I think the administration's view consistently has been there is no inconsistency with the JCPOA if it is outside the nuclear space, so long as it doesn't undermine or interfere with our commitments to fulfill what we committed to fulfill in the deal. Then the question becomes very much what specific legislation looks at and what are the details.
Well, because I think that while the President has the authority under existing law to sanction Iran, and the President has, which I support, I think it's not so terrible to have Congress come up with new sanctions if we feel Iran is violating its agreements. Certainly, in the launching of the ballistic missiles, the Chairman spoke about that with death to Israel on it. To me, that's a provocation. And when they continue to support terrorists, that's a provocation. And I think that sometimes it's important for the Congress to speak out on these things. You know, we've been having a lot of hearings on Iran and the implementation of JCPOA, and some of our previous hearings, some of our witnesses have said, well, if the Congress were to come out with new sanctions, it would just give it that little extra edge. It would really send a message to Iran that we are aware of what they're doing and we're not tolerating it. It's true that the President could implement and has the authority to implement new sanctions without the Congress acting, but I really think it's important that the Congress act. So I would just hope that the administration would seem to lessen its objection to Congress coming forward with new sanctions, because after all, when the JCPOA was put in front of the Congress, we were told specifically that it would not affect further sanctions against Iran for things other than their nuclear program, which would be terrorism and ballistic missiles and some other stuff.
Yeah, and that continues to be our view. I do want to point out, though, that Congress's sanctions contribution continues to be very potent right now. And I neglected to mention this, so I'm glad I have the opportunity. When we announce new designations in the terrorism, human rights, ballistic missile, Syria, Yemen space that have to do with Iranian actors, thanks to Congress and thanks to your efforts, those sanctions do not just touch U.S. actors. Those sanctions have secondary or extraterritorial effects around the world, which means that if a financial institution in East Asia, in Africa, in Europe, or the Gulf engages in transactions with any of the IRGC, the missile actors, the human rights designated actors, thanks to Congress, they face these secondary sanctions, namely a cutoff, a potential cutoff from the U.S. financial system. Those are sort of, if you will, supercharged sanctions, and that's only thanks to Congress's efforts. And so those stand behind every designation that we issue, even since implementation time.
Well, that's a good point, and that's why the chairman and I both feel so strongly that Congress needs to continue to be involved, and that if we need to issue further sanctions, it does not violate our obligation under the JCPOA to do so. I'm just wondering quickly if Ambassador Mull has anything to add to it.
No, thank you very much, Ranking Member Engel. Acting Undersecretary Zubin stated very clearly and succinctly that new sanctions on Iran's behavior outside the scope of the nuclear agreement would not be a violation of the JCPOA. We've been very clear about that publicly, as well as directly with our Iranian counterparts when they try to make that argument. We've been very clear throughout the negotiations, and as recently as my last meeting with the Iranians last week, that sanctions on such things as missile launches, which are inconsistent with UN Security Council Resolution 2231, weapons proliferation, destabilization, support for terrorism, will continue to have consequences from the United States government. There's no doubt about that in the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. We go to Mr. Chris Smith of New Jersey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you again for your very vigorous oversight of the Iranian deal, you and the ranking member. Let me just say a couple of points, and then I'll ask a question or two. This week, as we all know, our Nobel Peace Prize winning president lifted the lethal arms embargo on a cruel dictatorship, Vietnam, a nation that has crushed dissent. Journalists, bloggers, religious believers. The New York Times had asked him not to do it, as did other editorials. He did it anyway, despite the fact, and made a statement, and words are cheap in Washington, they're cheap in Hanoi as well. We asked for deeds. 2 weeks ago, I had a hearing right here with Mrs. Vu, the wife of Win Van Dai, a human rights defender I had met in 2005. Tremendous man, fighting, he, like so many others, fighting for fundamental human rights. He's in prison. And many of us said, Mr. President, if you're going to give something, please ask very specifically for the release of these prisoners and not just give all and get nothing in return. Administration officials have repeatedly testified that the deal in no way would impact our pressing Iran on human rights, yet the administration has only sanctioned one Iranian official for human rights abuses since they started negotiations. And Iran, like Vietnam, is a cruel dictatorship that uses torture to hurt and even kill dissidents. Why is that the case? Why is there not more robust effort on human rights? Secondly, credibility and messaging, even if it's clever and aggressive, needs to be honest. A May 5th New York Times Magazine article by David Samuels paints a highly disturbing insight into the administration's selling of the Iranian deal to the press, to Congress, to the American people. The piece, the New York Times piece, magazine notes that the narrative that Ben Rhodes shaped, the story of an Iran deal that began in 2013 with a moderate faction inside, led by the Rouhani regime, that beat hardliners. The Times points out that was actively misleading. It was to convey an impression that then people would follow up and say, oh, things have changed. Mr. Rhodes brags in the article that we, quote, created an echo chamber, an onslaught of freshly minted experts cheerleading for the deal. Rhodes said they were saying things that validated what we had given them to say. He also points out that he was able to spoon-feed 27-year-old reporters who knew nothing about this foreign policy, and then they, with these so-called experts, constantly do in the echo chamber. Gentlemen, that's not the way to do a deal. It ought to be honest. It should be transparent. You know, when you do things like this, you're saying, you know, you're duping the chairman or duping our ranking member, because I, too, felt the sense of, are we missing something here? And the more we look at the deal, the more we realize it's not. So on the human rights piece, if you could speak to that, what's your view of this New York Times Magazine piece? And finally, Ambassador Mull, last time you were here, I asked you the very specific question about the Iranian material. You said it had been taken out, put on a Russian boat, vessel, and that we didn't know where it went. Do we know where it is now? Has there been a U.S. Validation as to its whereabouts and whether or not it's under lock and key? All three of those questions.
Thanks very much, Congressman Smith, for those very good questions. On human rights, there has been no doubt about the strength of U.S. feeling about this very disturbing human rights situation in Iran. We've made that very clear publicly in repeated reports, whether on our religious freedom report, our human rights report. I can affirm to you that in every meeting in which I've participated with Secretary Kerry with Iranian counterparts, we've made very clear our concerns. And in fact, it was those concerns that really motivated our effort to get, I mean, every human rights violation is a serious one. We are most concerned when the human rights of Americans are violated. And so our concern about that motivated our very hard work to win the release of American detainees in Iran earlier this year. And I pledge to you, although human rights is outside the scope of the nuclear agreement, I know Secretary Kerry feels passionately about these issues and will continue to remain engaged. As opposed to the transparency of the negotiation of the agreement, I can tell you I've worked in the Foreign Service for more than 34 years now. I've never seen an international agreement that has had greater transparency than the Iran nuclear deal. It was released in full to the public on the very day that
But again,
it was agreed to.
I'm almost out of time. We couldn't read the IAEA inspection regime, could we? Protocol, I should say. I mean, I don't know what they're doing. We take them at their word. They're a good group, but I mean, transparency that needs to have a little asterisk on it, I would suggest.
Well, the IAEA has continued to report and will continue to do so. We've briefed the Congress dozens of times throughout the negotiations, and since then, and we are available, open and closed session to do so. Finally, your question about the enriched material that was removed from Iran to Russia. I was in Russia last month and in fact can confirm that that material is secure in Russia. There is no risk of its further proliferation. I'd be very pleased to brief you in a closed session on more details about that if you'd like, sir.
Okay, we're going to go to Mr. Brad Sherman of California.
People in this country want us to get along with everyone around the world. We long for peace. And there are those who say that sanctions contradict that. But when you look at what Iran has done in Syria, hundreds of thousands, perhaps 1 million people killed by Assad, with funds provided, weapons provided, thugs provided by the Iranian government. When you see people killed by barrel bombs and sarin gas, we realize that the right response to the Iranian regime cannot be kumbaya. This House was divided on the Iran deal, but we were united in one thing: sanctions work. And Mr. Zubin, and thanks to you and your predecessors, you proved they worked by working hard to make sure that they work. Some believe that the sanctions got us a good deal. Some believe the sanctions would have gotten us a better deal. The only agreement was sanctions work. And I join with the ranking member in saying that we ought to have new sanctions. And Ambassador Mull, thank you for clarifying that that will happen. I know that the Department of Treasury does additional designations, so you're doing your job. We need to do our job by passing statutes. Ambassador Mull, is it correct to say that the administration's view is that simply reauthorizing and extending the Iran Sanctions Act would in no way violate the JCPOA?
To be honest, Congressman, we are aware of interest in this House and throughout the Congress in general to reauthorize the ISA. We don't believe that we need to act on it now because it's valid through the end of this year.
Well,
but we're certainly open to
sometimes
working.
Congress likes to get our work done. I didn't ask you, the House schedule. We might want to get our work done sooner or later. Is it a violation of the JCPOA to simply keep our statute going the way it was the day the JCPOA was signed?
Sir, I'd be hesitant to speculate because I know under previous efforts to re-extend it, there have been other things added on to that
Again,
legislation.
if it were published in the exact language that existed on the day the JCPOA was signed, would that be a violation of the JCPOA?
Well, again, sir, we'd have to look at what was actually published. If it were
You know what's published. You don't want to answer the question. Mr. Zubin, technical legal question. You talked about branches of U.S. banks. Does that apply equally to subsidiaries, or is there does it depend on how it's legally authorized?
It does depend. And
So do you need legislation saying that the U.S. bank that owns a subsidiary would be subject to penalties if it allowed its subsidiary to do what its branch could not do?
So the distinction does exist, and that's not unique to Iran. That cuts across
Of course,
all of our sanctions programs. But I can tell you in practice, I don't know of a single subsidiary of a U.S. financial institution that's considering doing this business. Given their global platforms, I think it would be all but impossible.
I'm not aware of a problem either, but new legislation I think would be helpful. You referred to Mahan Air as the Quds Force airline. Congressman Henry and I have sent a letter to the EU ambassador, joined by the chair and the ranking member, many members of this committee, saying the EU should designate Mahan Air under UN anti-terrorism sanctions. Mahan Air cannot fly to Europe or Asia without ground service. It is now getting ground service from, for example, two companies, Airport Handling, which is based in Italy, and AHS Group, which is based in Germany. Now, these same service companies also service U.S. airlines. Put aside the terrorist risk of having the same handlers do both, and would the Treasury Department consider listing these two airport handling companies for doing business with Air Mahan?
So, thank you very much for your focus on this issue. We don't comment on who we might designate in the future, but I want to say the continued ability of Mahan Air to fly around the world as if it was a legitimate airline is something that I've raised in every capital that I've visited, and I don't believe it should be treated like a regular airline.
Well, the way to do it would be to designate these handlers, and you won't mention their names, but I just did, and I'd point out that our friends in the Ukraine ask us for so much, you would think that they would have listened to you when you made that point, and as we made that, make that point here. We've got three major auto manufacturers, including Fiat Chrysler and Mercedes, investing in auto manufacturing in Iran. It's only a matter of time before the products of these investments, which are also being made by Volvo, will be used by the IRGC. Would investing in auto factories that are producing transportation for the IRGC be sanctionable?
Any type of material support to the IRGC would be sanctionable. The IRGC.
What if you build an auto factory that sells its trucks to the IRGC?
Typically, what we're looking for if we're going to be designating a company is to see that it is witting or colluding, witting partner or colluding with the designated terrorist group. Investment in a firm that creates cars that then are subsequently appropriated by the IRGC would typically be a little bit too attenuated.
Well, no, not appropriated, just sold. I mean, you can't say you're not cooperating with the my auto dealer cooperates with me. I take my car in for service. He's a very cooperative guy. Are you saying that auto manufacturing facilities that sell trucks to the IRGC are going to be uncooperative?
No, although I might need to get the name of your auto dealer, because I don't have that experience. What I'm saying is that what we're looking for in going after new designation targets is those who are working with the designated entity. If we see companies that are propping up the RGC, whether with autos, whether with funds, whether with weapons, whether with experience,
I would ask you to
that's who
look
we would
at
target.
these investments. I'd ask you also that the time, in addition to sanctioning those who do the wrong thing, warning those who are thinking of doing the wrong thing, whether you choose to do it publicly or privately, and I look forward to giving you the address of Fiat, Chrysler, Volvo, and Mercedes. I yield back.
And I think, Mr. Sherman, thank you. I think Mr. Sherman's point is that more banks, more ticketing agents, more ground service providers, and other companies that are providing support for Mahan Air should be sanctioned. We go now to Mr. Dana Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And again, I'd like to thank you and the ranking member for taking very seriously the responsibility that we have to oversee what we disagreed on with you in terms of the Congress disagreed with you, many of us did, on this agreement with the mullah regime in Iran. The JCPOA was, the purpose, I take it, was, and this is what we were told, was to basically prevent Iran from at some point obtaining the capability of mass destruction on the governments that it considered to be under the command of the great Satan, meaning Israel, the United States, and anybody else who disagrees with them. So we did not want them to have this right to obliterate their enemies. They're at least not the right, but the capability. And this agreement was supposed to prevent that. And today we have 3 witnesses who are basically saying that it was a good agreement and it's brought us to a safer world. And what is concerning to me is when we go back, and as the chairman has pointed out, that the agreement itself has flaws and perhaps some intentional flaws. And one flaw would be that it expires after a certain length of time, and so we can see Iran moving toward that goal unimpeded now to get themselves to a point after expiration. They will be able to then have the power and the force that they want. But even more disconcerting to me is that the flaw is that the treaty may well have contained what I call weasel words. Now, I was a journalist for a number of years, and it is very easy to find out when someone really is trying to lie to you without lying to you. What they do is they put something in they word something in a way that it appears to be accomplishing something that it is not accomplishing. And as the chairman just pointed out in his questioning, that the actual words were changed to make them less enforceable. Now, shouldn't that be a warning sign to anybody who really takes this treaty seriously? And how do you explain that? I mean, the chairman had 2 or 3 examples where, for example, all right, let's just go directly to give you one I'll ask you about. Basically, and we have a situation where a rocket is designed, as long as it's not designed to carry a nuclear weapon, the Iranians now, because we've changed, there's a weasel word put into the treaty, that they now can work and obtain that nuclear weapons delivery system as long as it wasn't designed to be a nuclear weapons delivery system. And that was changed to the point where before they would not have been permitted that. Why was that changed?
As I noted, I was not involved in the negotiation of that word in that resolution, I do not agree that this is a dramatic difference in the effect of the resolution.
Okay, let's
Iran did not
let's
honor
go to
the
what you're
resolution
saying.
before.
It's not a dramatic difference. In one wording, it absolutely prohibited them from getting a rocket that could deliver a nuclear weapon system. After the wording, it now permits them to have it because with the strict definition of what the wording was, they now have an opening to possess a nuclear weapons delivery system. That's not dramatic. That's huge, except it's being hidden with weasel words. Okay,
There's
feel
no
free to
discussion
disagree.
of permission of Iran obtaining intercontinental or nuclear-capable ballistic missiles. There remains an absolute prohibition in that resolution of anyone providing
Missiles
the
that were
technology.
designed to deliver nuclear weapons, not technology that can achieve that goal. I mean, the fact is, if it can carry a nuclear weapon, even if it's not designed to do so, maybe it's designed to put up satellites. No, we don't want them to have that if that indeed will permit them to drop a nuclear weapon in Washington, D.C. with a missile using as a delivery system. If you don't call that dramatic, that is very dramatic. And I think that the people of the United States and we have been disserved. There's been a disservice to us and our security by this type of, and I say weasel words again, deception. A weasel word is a deception to make people think you're actually accomplishing something you're not accomplishing. Let me tell you, the interpretation, this is not a problem of interpretation. This is a problem with actually a negotiation failure that we have obviously reached an agreement with them, meaning the Mullah regime, which murders their own people, that we have actually reached an agreement with them, which they know will permit them to achieve their objective. This was not a good treaty to begin with. I appreciate your testimony, but obviously I disagree with it.
We go to Mr. Jerry Connolly of Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to our panel. Mr. Ambassador Mo, the Iran agreement addressed their support for Hezbollah, right?
No.
They addressed, well, certainly it addressed the issue of money laundering.
No.
Syrian Assad support?
No.
Terrorism and Mohan Air?
No, sir.
Yemen?
No, sir.
Death? Banning any further expression of death to America or death to Israel. Surely we addressed that in the agreement.
No, sir.
Well, what did the agreement address?
Sir, the agreement addressed limiting Iran's capability to develop fissile material to build a nuclear weapon.
Well, that's a unique approach. Surely in the Cold War with the Soviet Union, we had a different model. We addressed every negative behavior the Soviets were engaged in every agreement we approached, including in my friend Danny Rohrbacher's administration, the Reagan administration. Is that not correct? We addressed every aspect of Soviet behavior, unlike this agreement.
No, sir, that's not correct.
Oh. Well, let's get to this agreement. Did this agreement require Iran to modify the Iraq heavy water research reactor and to fill the reactor calandria with concrete?
Yes, sir.
Did they do that?
Yes, sir, they did.
Oh, my Lord. Did it require the reduction of installed centrifuges from 19,000 to 6,104?
Yes, sir. That's
And
true.
did they achieve that?
Yes, sir, they did.
Did it require that uranium enrichment be reduced to a level of 3.67%?
Yes, sir.
And did they achieve that?
Yes, sir.
Did it also require that their stockpile be reduced to 300 kilograms and the rest of it shipped out of the country?
Yes.
And did they do that?
Yes, sir, they did.
And you witnessed in Russia where it's being stored.
I confirmed in Russia where it is being stored.
Did they agree to allow the inspection and limitation on centrifuge production and uranium mines and mills under surveillance by international auspices?
Yes, sir.
And have they complied with that?
They are in full compliance.
And has the International Atomic Energy Agency verified this?
Yes, sir, they have.
And have we verified this, our government?
Yes, sir, we have.
Really? Well, I got to admit, I find, here's the second hearing. We had over 30 hearings in this. And oh my gosh, I tell you, I was worried. I had trouble sleeping when I listened to my colleagues predict cheating, stealing, subterfuge, evasion. And I hear you, Ambassador Mullis, tell me, well, maybe they wanted to do that, but they didn't. And so now that we're having hearings on compliance, we're talking about everything but compliance. We're talking about other behavior, which is to be condemned. I condemn it. I voted for sanctions on the other behavior. And by the way, did the agreement prohibit any further U.S. sanctions for any purpose? Are we prohibited under this agreement for looking at new sanctions on unrelated behavior, that is to say, unrelated to the nuclear agreement?
Yes, that's correct, sir.
So we're not prohibited.
We're not.
We're not prohibited. We could, we can entertain
that
other sanctions for their support for Hezbollah, for example.
Yes, absolutely, sir.
Or putting sanctions on Mohan Air.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
But the gentleman asked a question early on in your questions.
My friend.
Would like an answer to that, or?
Well, if my friend would withhold, because I have
The gentleman will withhold the time belonging.
because I only have
Mr.
58
Connolly.
seconds, otherwise I would, and if the chairman will give me time, that's great. These arguments are, you know, to me, a smokescreen for not addressing the main issue. And the other argument used, which is clever but still flawed, which is perfect is the enemy of good. The fact that it's not in perpetuity. We couldn't achieve Iran forever forswearing any nuclear ambition means this is flawed. Was that ever in the cards, Ambassador Mull? I mean, I thought we hadn't even talked to them for almost 30 years. So to get them to agree to this and comply seems to be, I don't know, to me, some kind of achievement. And why don't you comment, because my time is up.
Yes, sir. We believe it is an achievement. We believe that we and our allies in the region are considerably safer because of the achievements and full implementation of this agreement. In terms of whether it ever sunsets, while it is true certain restrictions on Iran's capability on its stockpile and so forth expire after certain periods, Iran's commitment and full access to the International Atomic Energy Agency is in perpetuity. And so whenever the IAEA believes that Iran is moving to develop a military application for its nuclear program, it will report as such, regardless of when that happens. And we have every capability through law and through previous executive orders to respond immediately to put back in place the very pressures that brought about this deal in the first place. So we're very confident that we have the tools to make sure that the security from this deal is long-lasting, and if it's not, we can turn the tables and go back to the status quo ante.
Mr. Joe Wilson of South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield 10 seconds to my colleague from California, Mr. Rohrabacher.
Just to answer Mr. Connolly's point, which was, yes, in the Reagan administration, it was different. The fact is that in the Reagan administration, our goal was to bring down the Soviet Union, and even as we negotiated with them on various treaties, we had efforts all across the globe to bring down that government, which is exactly what we should be doing with the Mullah regime, and we're not doing.
And again, thank you very much, Chairman Ed Royce, and I want to thank also Congressman, the ranking member, Elliot Engel. I was grateful to actually vote with both of them opposing this dangerous deal. And sadly, as we hear more and more about it, it becomes more dangerous, and it's so sad that we have a Mullah regime which is oppressing the dynamic people of Iran. They continue, as was cited, to proclaim death to America, death to Israel. That has not changed. I just find it incredible. And then my concerns, Ambassador Mull, have been verified through the IAEA report. And that is, in early March, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency disclosed that certain agreements reached under the deal, dangerous deal, limit inspectors from publicly reporting on potential violations by the Mueller regime. The Director General Amano of the IAEA, which is responsible for ensuring Iran complies with the agreement, told reporters that his agency is no longer permitted to release details about Iran's nuclear program in compliance with the deal. The recent reports are devoid of details about critical implementation issues, including the amounts of low-enriched uranium in Iran, the nature of centrifuge, rotor, and bellows manufacturing, and advanced centrifuge research and development activities. Why would the administration agree to limit IAEA reporting? Why has the IAEA reporting on Iran been constrained? What specific component of the deal or UN Security Council resolution that implemented it limits the IAEA reporting? And are there any Americans or Canadians who are serving as inspectors?
Congressman, thanks for those questions. Last week, I was in Vienna and I met with the Director General of the IAEA, Mr. Amano. I believe those press comments attributed to him are inaccurate and misinterpreted. It's quite clear that the IAEA will be reporting every 3 months on the status of implementation. Now, in terms of the level of detail, I agree with you that in the last report there was less detail than in previous reports. That's because the Iranian nuclear program is significantly smaller than what it was as a result of this deal. The IAEA confirmed that Iran was within all of the numerical limits to which it committed. Director General Amano assured me last week that the IAEA would continue to address in its forthcoming reports whether or not Iran is complying with every element of the deal. So I think you can count on full reporting to continue from the IAEA.
But clearly, it was stated that it's devoid of details about critical implementation issues. And whether it's low or not, it could say low or non-existent, including the amounts of low-enriched uranium in Iran, the nature of centrifuge, rotor, and bellows manufacturing, and advanced centrifuge research and development activities. That should be really easy to say yes or no. And then, Mr. Countryman, the development of missile technology and testing, to me it's incredible. It's very revealing. There was only one reason that you would be developing an intercontinental ballistic missile capability, and that is to deliver a nuclear weapon, and it would be against American families. And in the past month, we've had the spectacle of Iran testing a missile, which in Hebrew, so people who would be affected understand, as cited by Mr. Sherman, and that is that in Hebrew it stated, Israel will be wiped off the map. This was on a test. How can we possibly trust such a regime that makes such defiance as in the aftermath of this dangerous deal?
I don't trust him further than I can spit.
Well, great. And then what measures are there? And I'm grateful that I worked with Congressman Seth Moulton in the NDAA. We have a requirement that there be a response to missile testing and identification of missile testing. Is there anything in place to let the American people know what's going on?
I'm sorry, what's going
to
on?
To identify a missile test and what the implication of the missile test by Iran.
Yeah, there's a lot of information, some of which is not appropriate for this forum, but we are always prepared to brief members on the full range of information that we have about Iranian missile tests.
Well, American families are at risk. They need to know. I yield the balance of my time.
Go to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. I appreciate the testimony with respect to the compliance, and I think for many of us who, in fact, supported this deal, we are pleased that, in fact, compliance with the requirements have been met, or that Iran has taken the steps that are required. I think part of the challenge for us, though, is that we were told during this process that getting the nuclear issue off the table was so critical, and that we actually could expect Iran would engage in additional destabilizing activity. And in fact, people suggested some of the resources that they would have access to and some of the political needs that the regime would have would cause them to be worse in many areas, in terrorism and human rights and other areas. And so we were assured that this would give us an opportunity to push back hard in these other areas because the danger of a nuclear Iran would be off the table. And I was persuaded by that. So I'm very, very interested to hear the administration's efforts with respect to pushing back hard. And I want to begin in the area of human rights. What has the administration done since the signing of the JCPOA with regard to imposing sanctions on human rights violators in Iran? By all accounts, there's been an increase in human rights violations, I think in part as the regime intends to sort of show that they're still in charge despite this agreement. We've seen an increase in human rights violations. What has the administration done since the signing of the JCPOA with respect to human rights violators in Iran, if anything?
Congressman Cicilline, thanks for the question. As I mentioned earlier to Congressman Smith, the Obama administration is deeply concerned about the human rights situation in Iran. And in confronting that situation, we have a variety of tools available at our disposal. Sanctions are certainly one important part of it.
Sorry to interrupt you. I probably should have been more precise with the question. I know you said you raised it in meetings. Has the administration done anything with respect to the imposition of sanctions on any individual or entity since the signing of the JCPOA with respect to human rights violations?
There has not been a specific sanction on a human rights case since the signing of it.
Not one.
But we have managed to address human rights concerns, for example, by getting Americans out of
No, I appreciate that, and I
detention.
congratulate you for that. But my point is, the existing sanctions regime has not caused the administration to impose a single imposition of a sanction for human rights. The second question is, there's been a lot of discussion about additional sanctions. I think everyone acknowledges that the JCPOA deals with nuclear sanctions and that non-nuclear sanctions are obviously remain a tool. And so I'd ask Ambassador Mr. Zubin, you recently expressed some concerns about the overuse of sanctions and that sanctions, the imposition of sanctions can impose costs. Are there circumstances in which you think we should be imposing additional sanctions on Iran, particularly in the context of the ballistic missiles testing? It appears as if it is not a violation of JCPOA, according to the administration, but clearly a violation of Security Council Resolution 2231. And if additional sanctions are not a useful tool, what do you suggest we do to dissuade or put pressure on Iran not to engage in this very nefarious activity with respect to ballistic missiles?
Thank you, Congressman. And I do want to clarify the quote you're referencing about the potential overuse of sanctions was made in a broader discussion about this tool as we move potentially into for certain into a new administration, and how to use this tool, the tool of sanctions, both on the congressional side and the executive branch side, in a judicious way that will preserve its influence. It was not made with respect to
No, I
Iran.
understand.
With respect to their ballistic missile program, I think sanctions are a key piece. I think we do need to keep the pressure on, and I find particularly important those brokers, procurement agents, who are helping to mask the ultimate end user. And that's who this SHIG group that I mentioned earlier, the SPIG group, that's who Iran's missile agencies are using to get the parts they need in violation of UN Security Council resolutions. The more we can expose those actors, both the individuals involved in the companies, the better, and the more we've seen it frustrate them. But I do want to say that that public effort is not the only thing we have going. Obviously, there's strategic interdictions that are going on at sea, some of which you would see in the paper, some of which you would not. And we have our own version of that in a financial sense, which is payments that are being made to broker procurement of dual-use items. We're sometimes able to block those payments mid-transfer, which not only causes real damage to the procurement efforts, but also can sometimes spark a lot of useful intelligence from the affected individual.
But am I correct in assuming that it would be useful in terms of sending a message to the Iranians that Congress and the United States is serious about stopping their ballistic missile system and stopping their gross violations of human rights by enacting additional sanctions in the non-nuclear sphere as an expression of Congress and ultimately the American people's strong condemnation of ballistic missiles or human rights violations, that it would actually strengthen your hand as the administration to know that, for the Iranians to know, there are members of Congress that feel very strongly about this, reflecting the sentiments of the American people, and we're committed to using all the tools at our disposal outside the JCPOA, not involving any of the nuclear sanctions, to really effectively dissuade them and persuade them and impose costs on them for engaging in ballistic missiles testing or human rights violations.
So I think the focus of this body, of Congress, on these non-nuclear threats has been and remains essential. And frankly, the fact that it's been a bipartisan focus has been extremely powerful, and it does give us leverage in talking to the Iranians and in talking to our international allies. With respect to the enactment of new sanctions legislation, I'll repeat what I said to the chairman, which is, as a technical matter, the deal is talking about nuclear sanctions. As a practical matter, if legislation were to undermine the deal by taking off the table commitments that we had put on the table, that would be a problem. And obviously, we don't want to see new legislation interfere with our fulfillment of the JCPOA.
Understood. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Chairman. Ambassador Mull, you said in your opening comments JCPOA had been successfully implemented, cutting its enrichment program by more than 2/3, increasing the breakout time of 2 months to more than a year. So it's your estimation then that they went from 2 months to 12 months. So in your opinion, we gained 10 months.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's math. You also said we have preserved our abilities to snap back penalties. Then you further said that at the request of our foreign friends, and I'm paraphrasing on this, and we've been explaining the lifting of our sanctions. So the explaining of the lifting of those sanctions, that discussion time is going to be, is that going to take a month or two?
We try to be responsive, Congressman, to whenever our international partners express questions about U.S. law and U.S. procedures, not just on Iran, but on anything. Since the implementation date was reached in the agreement back in January, there's been a flood of requests, mostly from the world financial centers in Asia.
So that really is my answer, a flood of requests from around the world. So if in the event that Iran would get very aggressive and start doing things again that we felt like a snapback sanction was in order here, it would take time, would it not, to explain to our friends around the world as to why we think they violated it and why we think an action is necessary?
I don't think it would take that much time if Iran...
How much time do you think it would take?
To notify the world of an Iranian violation?
No, to explain why snapback sanctions, well, that, and then to explain and get their buy-in on why snapback sanctions were necessary.
Well, I mean, certainly if we decided to snap back, we would make an instant announcement of that. I couldn't speculate if there are questions from our allies.
Okay, so it would take a month or two. I'm going to leave it at that because I'm going to run short on time. It's not going to be instantaneous. I think snapback is the wrong word there, okay? Mr. Countryman, you said it's not sanctions but UN resolutions that cause Iran to change its pursuit of weapons. It's not sanctions or UN resolutions, but trade control. Now, notice you didn't read from your remarks. You pretty much spoke from the heart, I guess, as it were. So if trade control was really the force de jure there that we needed, didn't we have them going in the right direction? The sanctions had them going in the right direction? They were hurting.
Well, if you'll give me just a moment, I make a distinction between sanctions that are intended to impose an economic cost and change behavior, and that's something that my colleague Mr. Zubin especially specializes in, and strategic trade control, which is how the United States cooperates with countries around the world to ensure that states of concern and non-state actors don't get their hands on dual-use technology, whether it's nuclear or missile-related or anything else.
Okay, so you're saying the force behind the sanctions was the trade control with all of our friends Ambassador Mull and I was talking about.
Well, there have been a number of institutions in place for years. The Missile Technology Control Regime, 40 most advanced countries in the world on ballistic missile technology that cooperate against providing that kind of technology to countries like Iran. The Proliferation Security Initiative started under the Bush administration, and they are backed.
I get what you meant. The denial of access to our monetary system being somewhere up there in the upper echelon of one of those sanctions. Agreed?
Yeah, I would put that again. I'm not trying to make fine distinctions, but I'd say that's more in the category of economic sanctions.
Okay, well, I want to go over
and
Mr.
trade control.
Subin on this because he did say supercharged sanctions could be used. Describe for us, if you would, the difference between, normal sanctions, lesser sanctions, and supercharged sanctions.
I'd be happy to, and I did not mean to coin a new term, and certainly not that term, but
Well, when I was in high school, supercharging meant something different, but go ahead.
what I meant was to refer to the reach of a targeted sanction. So just to give you a very specific example, if we target a human rights actor in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we add them to the OFAC sanctions list, that binds the actions of U.S. banks, U.S. companies. Foreign actors are still permitted without any fear of U.S. consequences to do business, as long as they keep their transactions out of the U.S. So they can't be routing those transfers through the U.S., but if they want to do it in local currency, fine. When it comes to Iran, what Congress did was to say, no, anyone who does business anywhere around the world in whatever currency with an Iranian actor that's on the OFAC blacklist faces a potential cutoff from the U.S. financial system. That's what I was referring to as these greatly augmented sanctions designations.
Okay. Thank you for that distinction, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Meadows of North Carolina, who was instrumental in the Hezbollah sanctions legislation we referenced earlier. As a matter of fact, he was the driving force, the driver behind the bill that this committee put out on Hezbollah sanctions. Mr. Meadows.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for your leadership on that particular effort. And so, Mr. Zubin, let me come to you, because all these sanctions, and as we talk about this, it gets very confusing. And so we've removed some sanctions, we've left some in place. To the average elected official, do we have really the intellectual discernment to decide which sanction is which and when it should be applied and when it should not be applied? Is that easily done?
I sure hope we have that capability. I mean, that's what my office is there to do.
That's what your office, but it's not necessarily what my office or other elected officials' offices in terms of figuring out sanctions and how they should apply and if they apply in every case. Is that correct? So if we have questions, you are the go-to person to figure out whether we're complying. Is that correct?
We would be happy to provide any consultation on that that's sought.
All right. Since we're talking today about compliance and we're talking about centrifuges and all kinds of other things, Ambassador Mull, can you tell me why, when we look at the JCPOA, we're talking about centrifuges, and they were, quote, to be made inoperable, and you've changed the language to be disabled, and most of those centrifuges, from what I understand, have just been turned off and put in a storage place in Iran. Is that correct?
Sir, the centrifuges that have been dismantled have had all of the equipment.
All of them. All of them have been
they're allowed,
disassembled, is what you're saying.
They're allowed certainly 5,060 to be operating.
No, but I'm talking about of the 19,000, you disassembled all of them, and they can't be put back into place very quickly. This is your sworn testimony.
That's right.
All right. So are they being stored in Iran?
Yes, sir.
So how long would it take them to get them out of storage and put them back in operation if they decided to do that today?
If they decided to do so, it would depend. Some of them are stored in
well, I know they
places.
got rid of some of them that weren't actually in use. But what I'm talking about is the ones they were supposed to dismantle. How long would it take them to take that from storage and get them back in?
Well, this all factors into our calculation of breakout time. It would certainly be a matter of several months.
That's not my question.
It would be
That's a great answer to a question I didn't ask. How long would it take to take the centrifuge from the storage and actually get it back in place again and flick on the switch?
Well, again, it depends on the centrifuge. It depends on the location. All of this, the storage is completely, sir, under monitoring full time by the IAEA.
I didn't ask that. That's two answers to questions I didn't ask. I asked you how quickly from the storage, could they be back in place? A month?
Which centrifuge and from which location do you mean? It depends.
All right, let's take some of the centrifuges of the 19,000 that we put in storage. What would be the fastest time that they could get one of them that is most operable and put it back in place? The fastest time, days.
Sir, I don't have an immediate answer for you. I'd have to consult with our technical.
Can you give me a range? 7 days?
I'd have to check with our technical engineers to get.
All right, well, let me tell you the reason why I ask. I've got a letter here that went to Governor Pat McCrory from you, which by many descriptions is a pro-Iranian marketing material suggesting that we ought to do more business with Iran. And it says, well, we need to check on sanctions and asking the governor to do that, of which they don't have the expertise. They've asked me about the expertise in terms of compliance. Why would you send a pro-Iranian marketing letter to my governor?
Sir,
who instructed you to do that?
Well, with respect, I disagree that it's a pro-Iranian
Well, some
marketing
have described
letter.
it that way, and you can disagree,
Yeah.
so we'll disagree on that. Who instructed you to do that?
In the agreement, the United States government committed to inform state and local authorities about changes in the nuclear situation in Iran. That
So you
could have
sent a
warranted.
letter like this to all 50 states?
That's right, because the
All right.
United States government committed to do that.
So in doing that, you went to great lengths, number of paragraphs to talk about how great this is and all that, and selling it, instead of just saying that you need to look at changing your laws as it relates to that. Why was it in such a pro-Iranian manner?
Sir, I disagree that it was in a pro-Iranian
Well,
manner.
we'll give it to the press and let
described-
them opine on it. And so, obviously, is this something that you released to the press so they know all about it?
I did not release it to the press.
Okay, well, we'll let them do that. I guess the other question is since we have our ally Israel, and many of them are under attack by a BDS movement, is the State Department going to send out a similar letter saying that states should not actually embark on a BDS movement for all 50 states for our ally Israel?
I'm sorry, sir, what, a BDS movement? I'm not sure.
Boycott, divestment.
Divestment sanction. Sir, our relations
It's troubling
with
that
Israel,
you wouldn't know what that is. I'll yield back.
Mr. Scott DeJoy of Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Countryman, did I hear you say that it was your belief that Iran never intended to slow its testing of ballistic missiles?
I don't know about never, and it's difficult to talk about intent, but the record shows that they have had a consistent, steady program of ballistic missile development for missiles of various range, similar to that of a number of other countries in the region and beyond the Middle East.
And it's your job to apply sanctions for violations?
It's my job, with the support of a number of agencies, both to apply strategic trade controls to inhibit Iran acquiring the technology, and in cooperation with Treasury and others to apply sanctions to entities in Iran and outside Iran that violate those restrictions.
Okay, and you stated in your written testimony that all the sanction authorities we need are already in place, and we have repeatedly used our own domestic authorities to sanction entities involved in Iran's ballistic missile program, and will continue to do so as warranted. I mean, you can say that you've got the authorities to deal with it, but that rings hollow. The Iran, North Korea, and Syria Non-Proliferation Act of 2006, which levies U.S. sanctions on entities connected with Iran ballistic activity, is implemented by your office. But the GAO study commissioned by this committee from last year shows the State Department to be completely delinquent in applying these sanctions. The report that triggers designation for sanctions for 2011 showed up in December of 2014, 36 months late. The last report sat on the Deputy Secretary's desk for more than a year, according to GAO. The State Department needs to comply with INCSA's 6-month reporting cycle and minimize the delays in its ability to impose INCSA sanctions. Would you agree?
I read the GAO report. It's a good one. I agree that we have been slow. I would not say delinquent. I think the report did a good job of stating the important verification process that we have to go through in a complex interagency process. I'm determined to do better.
Well, they also stated that political concerns such as international negotiations, relations with countries involved in transfers can delay the state implementing the process. Would you agree with that?
No.
So the Ben Rhodes comment and all that has nothing to do with protecting the President's legacy, in your opinion?
I don't know which comment you're referring to.
Well, the echo chamber, the fact that they were trying to hide the fact that this is not really a good deal. But you said that you don't think you're completely delinquent. Do you not think 36 months behind on a 6-month window is completely delinquent?
I think if you wanted a report every 6 months, you would get an inadequate report. I think that we have to do better and faster, but I think
they're shooting missiles now. I mean, we agree there's missiles that have Israel needs to be abolished, and you're saying that we have all the people in place to apply these sanctions. That's not very comforting when we're looking at 2-3 year delays in a program where we have a deal that's designed to curtail the development of nuclear weapons, but a ballistic missile is the essential component to delivering these not only to Israel but to our allies in the United States. And you say you have to do better. It doesn't give me much comfort. Where are the delinquent reports right now? Where are they in the process?
Well, first, I would note that INCSNA is not our only tool. It is a congressionally mandated tool, and we take that very seriously, and we want it to be a good decision process and one that can be justified and explained fully to you when it is delivered. But we have other tools available if we need them in order to move against individual entities. In terms of where we are in the report, I am hopeful that you will get the 2013 report in the very near future. The 2014 report is well in preparation, and as I said, we're trying to.
Do we know whose desks they're on now? Do you know where they're at? I mean, we're talking reports from 3 years ago on a 6-month window again, and you're saying we need to do better. Do you know where they're at?
Yes.
Who has them?
They're in the process, and I think they will be completed shortly.
So you're not going to tell me who has them. You're just going to tell us that, you know, we're going to do better. We're 3 years behind. They're shooting missiles. We're in the middle of a deal that Secretary Kerry all but admitted it's not a matter of if it fails, it's more when it fails, which could be a year, 2 years, 3 years. So you're applying sanctions from reports from 2 to 3 years ago for things that are happening now. Is that what you're telling us?
I'm saying that we have sanctioned the primary entities involved in Iran's missile program, and if we rush this to you any sooner, it will not make a dramatic change in the entities that are already sanctioned.
Or the President may look bad.
Pardon me?
Or the President may look bad, as the GAO reported that that's the reason for these delays.
The gentleman's time
The
is
GAO is not
expired.
correct on that point.
We are now going to Mr. Lee Zeldin of New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Mull, you referenced earlier historic verification and monitoring regime. Have you yet read the verification regime outlined in the side deals between the IAEA and Iran?
I'm not aware of any side deals between, which side deal do you mean?
I'm referencing the deals between the IAEA and Iran to decide how the JCPOA is going to be implemented. What governs the verification of the Iran nuclear deal?
No, Iran and the IAEA have a confidential safeguards agreement that just like every member of the IAEA
We're talking
has
about
those.
the same
Those
exact thing. Have you read that?
No, sir, I have not.
Okay. I would just offer up for you, for Secretary Kerry, who was here a few months ago, it's difficult to vouch for a historic verification and monitoring regime when you don't know what the historic verification and monitoring regime is. All you know is what's contained in the JCPOA, but you don't know what's included in the agreement between the IAEA and Iran, especially as we read Associated Press reports about how Iran might be collecting some of their own soil samples, responsible for collecting some of, inspecting some of their nuclear sites. As we read what the Associated Press reports as far as the verification of the JCPOA, if you haven't yet read it, it's impossible to say that's a historic verification and monitoring regime because you don't know what it is. The administration has says this deal is not built on trust, it's built on verification. Why didn't the Obama administration ask the Iranians to sign the JCPOA?
Why did we ask them to sign it?
Why didn't we ask them to sign it?
Well, the JCPOA is a political agreement, and that it emerged, it evolved that way in the course of negotiations, that in order to preserve our ability to exact the kind of penalties and the kind of nimble ability and agility that we would have to exact penalties if the agreement were not implemented correctly, we believed it served our interest best to have this as a political agreement.
I would assume that if you have you've bought cars in your life, you've bought houses in your life, you have signed many agreements, you have signed your name on all sorts of things. I would imagine if there was an example we need to come up with of something where you should get a signature, that the JCPOA is a great example of something where you ask the Iranians, would you mind signing it? The administration decided not to.
Yeah.
Now, what is a political commitment? Can you like the Secretary Kerry has referred to the JCPOA not as a treaty, and the reason is he said because he wouldn't have been able to get it passed. That's what he said right here. The reason why this isn't a treaty is because he wouldn't have been able to get it passed. Ridiculous answer, but moving on. He says it's not an executive agreement. It's a political commitment. What's a political commitment as defined by the Obama administration?
A political commitment is one that is the official policy of the United States government, that we are fully committed as a government to implementing the deal on its terms. As a political commitment, we or any future government is free to withdraw from that agreement with a minimum of legal difficulty. We've decided that
I'm sorry, you said you're allowed to withdraw from the political commitment without legal difficulty?
That's right, yes.
Okay, that's what we're defining the JCPOA as something that you can withdraw from without legal difficulty?
Well, if other parties, namely Iran, decides to withdraw from it, there are going to be very serious consequences for that. We have preserved, by establishing this as a political agreement, our freedom of action in ensuring there are dramatic consequences for withdrawal from that agreement.
Okay. So should the Iran Sanctions Act be extended as is?
I know it's in place until December of this year. We're ready to work with the Congress in addressing that question in the run-up to December.
What is the administration's position on the Iran Sanctions Act? Should it be extended as is?
Our position is that we're willing to talk with the Congress, congressional leadership about that.
Okay. When do you plan on coming up with a position on the Iran Sanctions Act?
Again, we are open to work with the Congress on this. We're at your disposal.
Well, I have a position. The Iran Sanctions Act should be extended as is. What say you?
Well, let's sit down and talk about what that means. And during further...
What does that mean? It means the Iran Sanctions Act, as is, should be extended, as is.
But in previous efforts to extend the act, there have been efforts, suggestions to change the implementation of it, change the authorization.
Extending as is.
But there are voices in Congress who would like to amend it. So we need to have a conversation about it.
Okay. Well, the Obama administration needs to. I know that there's a whole thing about legacy and turning over to the next administration that Iran never acquired a nuclear weapon. But many of you all need to pray to God that the next administration cleans up your mess. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. We go to Mr. Scott Perry of Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Countryman, good morning. You started with the administration in September of 2011? Is that correct?
I've been a Foreign Service officer since 1982.
But you started with
my current post in 2011.
in this position, 2011, right?
Yes.
Did you have any participation in the negotiation/agreement that we're speaking of, the JCPOA?
I was not a member of the negotiating team.
Okay, what was your involvement? You are the Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation, and I would think that this would fall under the non-proliferation moniker, if you would. So, what were your duties regarding this program, the negotiations, the deal, et cetera?
As you know, the negotiating team was small and worked very well. I provided a couple of my experts for technical support.
Okay, so you were fully aware of what was happening and who was doing it, even though you weren't there. You provided experts, but you knew when things were happening, who was talking to whom, those type of things, yes?
I knew when people were talking to each other. I did not know a lot about the substance that was being discussed in the
Okay,
negotiations.
so you knew when people were talking to each other. And so then you knew when Ben Rhodes made the claim that we were dealing with moderates in Iran, that was completely false. That was a fraudulent statement. You knew that because you knew the timeline, right? You started in 2011, and you provided expertise, and then you would have known that negotiations actually started in mid-2012.
I know when negotiations began under the previous Iranian presidency.
Right,
I
you
know
knew
when
that, right?
negotiations began under President Rouhani's presidency. Did not know the substance of it.
I didn't ask you.
And
I understand it, but you knew when that happened, right? So when Ben Rhodes said that we were dealing with, and sold this to the American people, and the rubes up here in Congress, right, us primitive people up here in Congress that question the timeline, but you knew at that time that that was a falsehood, right? I mean, you knew, because you knew that it started in 2012, and Rouhani wasn't elected until June of 2013. So you knew that, right?
I do not believe it was a falsehood, and no,
but
I did not.
You did not know that.
And there is no secret. There was nothing concealed here. At the time of the preliminary agreement signed in 2013.
You knew that negotiations started in 2012, right? Did you know that?
Did I know the instant they began? No.
But okay, so around sometime mid-2012, maybe December 2000, sometime in 2012, right? You knew that because you were providing material help, right?
I was providing an expert who gave advice to the negotiators.
So did you know or didn't you know?
Did I know what, sir?
When negotiations started, generally speaking.
I know.
Based on that. When did you provide the individuals that helped?
Generally speaking, I knew.
Generally speaking, you knew. So, and you also knew, I'm thinking, that Rouhani wasn't elected till June of 2013, right? Right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So then when Ben Rhodes made the statement that we were dealing with the moderate in Rouhani.
At what time did he make this statement?
He made the statement throughout the negotiation because that was what we were supposed to accept here, even though many of us did not and questioned that. Did you know then?
In 2013, when the JPOA, the interim agreement with Iran, was concluded, there was extensive briefing to Congress and to the press about the history of contacts between Iran and the United States.
Leading up to that, we had questions about that, and the word was that we were all supposed to accept that these were moderates, and this is where the negotiation began. And I'm not saying you came to Congress and said that, but you knew that that was not necessarily the case.
I strongly disagree, sir.
You did not
know. I have not heard any false statements from the White House. I've heard a lot of statements during the discussion of this agreement, but not false ones from the White House.
Did you make any statements in support of the claim that this administration was negotiating with moderates from Iran on this deal? Did you make any of those statements?
Not that I recall.
Did you support any of those statements and any of the statements that you made? Did you support them?
Not that I recall.
Not that you recall.
My focus has been on the substance of the agreement. And having done non-proliferation for 5 years, I see an agreement that is the most detailed of any kind of arms control agreement.
Mr. Countryman, understand that while the last questioner just outlined the fact that we're 36 months late on triggers designation for sanctions, we have a trust issue here. We have a trust issue between Congress and the administration who objectively falsified the timeline when many of us here knew it. And I think you could have said something, but you chose not to. For whatever reason, that's your business.
A false timeline. I have not
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We thank the witnesses. We thank General Scott Perry and the other members of the committee here for their participation as well. And we'll continue the dialogue on this issue. Thank you very much. Appreciate your attendance. We stand adjourned.